So good morning, everybody, and welcome to CUPA Conference 2019, 8 a.m. first day. Glad you could all make it. Again, my name is Kevin Ong. This is Nicole Heath. Just a couple quick logistics regarding the session. Originally, we were going to open it up to having questions throughout the presentation, but since we are recording this, we'd like to hold all questions till the end. And when you do have questions, just come up to the mic in the center and have at it. So, quick start to what we're going to cover. So, I'm going to cover a couple things, starting with the regulations, looking at what the wording is, what the language includes, and looking at the requirements from that section. Then we're going to cover a couple of the methodologies that we commonly see in Contra Costa County, and then do a little bit of a deep dive into what kind of deficiencies do we see, what have our facilities faced in terms of challenges in implementing a PHA or hazard review program. And then Nicole will go into more of our auditing practices in terms of how Contra Costa approaches auditing PHAs and essentially using it as a springboard to look into other prevention program elements such as mechanical integrity, incident investigations, and the like. And then we'll open it up for questions. So taking a first look at who's going to actually get affected. Program 1 has no regulatory language requiring hazard reviews of PHAs, but starting from Program 2 onwards, we do have the requirements. So Program 2 has hazard review requirements, and Programs 3 and 4 both include requirements for PHAs. And I wanted to pose a quick question here. We weren't originally going to go too much into Program 4 language for process hazard analyses. Just as a show of hands, who is actually interested in us going into that language? Any CUPAs with refineries? Okay, got a couple hands. Yeah, because of that, I think we're just gonna hold off on it. If you guys do have specific questions, Nicole and I will be available, as well as other members from our engineering team up here, so feel free to ask us later. So going into what goes into a hazard review or PHA, I just wanted to highlight some of the commonalities between the two languages. And really, as a practice, hazard reviews and PHAs really do serve the same purpose. We're trying to identify the hazards, trying to see what the potential consequences are, what kind of safeguards do we have in place to prevent or mitigate those consequences, and just see is there anything that we need to do better, right? So I just made a couple highlights here. Hazards, potential accidental releases. In terms of the language that's used in Program 2 and Program 3, Program 2 specifies safeguards and methods of detecting releases, whereas Program 3 just says engineering and administrative controls. So engineering controls are just what's built into the process. Administrative controls being the policies and procedures of a facility, just to try and address those. Both hazard reviews and PHAs also are looking at external events, including seismic events. So because we are in California and yeah, we're all waiting for the big one to happen, just to see what could happen to our facilities, we do look at seismic more rigorously than other places. In addition to that, Program 3 does highlight a couple additional requirements. So looking at human factors. So how do humans impact or can potentially impact our process? What kind of interactions can there potentially be between a human operator and the process that is in place, and trying to address any concerns there. Then we also have stationary source siting, so looking at how within a facility, how is the process related to buildings, how is it related to, in terms of like an emergency response portion, ingress and egress into a process. And then lastly, just the requirement to identify previous incidents within a PHA. And that can be expanded on a little bit more with regards to not just previous incidents that may have occurred on site, but also in looking at incidents that have occurred in industry. So take, for example, ammonia refrigeration. Maybe your site hasn't had any previous incidents, but there are known incidents of ammonia releases in other facilities and other locations that are common in industry. that is something that you'd still want to see within the PHA to say, okay, can that potentially occur at our site? That's where you want to raise it up in the PHA. And just a quick comment, even though the language is written into Program 3, it is still seen as a good practice for Program 2 facilities to review those incidents in their hazard review. So additional commonalities, there are the documentation requirements, so looking at documenting the hazard review or PHA, having that timetable of 2.5 years for specific action items that don't require a turnaround. That was all updated in the 2015 CalCUPA update, I believe. And then renewing your hazard review or PHA every 5 years, as well as retaining the documentation for the lifetime of the process. Program 3 has a little more detailed language with regards to what needs to be documented and how it needs to be documented. I'm not going to go too much into that, but it is written directly into the regulation. So looking more at the differences now, the first one that I wanted to bring up was with the teams required to run a hazard review or PHA. So the regs specifically spells out for both Program 2 and Program 3 that you need a team to run this analysis. With regards to Program 2, you're looking at a team that includes one employee with experience and knowledge of the process. That's it. With Program 3, though, and Program 4, really, you're looking at least one employee with process knowledge, as well as one person familiar with the methodology employed. And we'll get into the methodologies a little bit later. Some additional Program 2 requirements include an inspection of the process to see that it meets the design codes and standards required, either by state laws or by industry standards. And then with the 2015 update, again, Program 2 introduced language that said, in terms of revalidation of hazard reviews, it really switched to an alternating structure. So starting with your initial your initial hazard review, you can do one revalidation, and then you would have to do a full hazard review at the 10-year mark, essentially. So, and even though it is only written into Program 2 language, we do see it as a practice in Program 3. Even though it originally, well, from what I was told, it was supposed to be in both Program 2 and Program 3 language, but somewhere along the lines, it got dropped from Program 3. If you want more details about it, I'm sure there are more people in the room here with that history and are more familiar with the 2015 update. Or maybe Nicole can share a bit more about that. But yeah, that should cover the differences there. Like I said earlier, identified a couple Program 4 changes within this presentation, but I'm not going to go into it too much here since there aren't too many CUPAs with Program 4 facilities here. Okay, next, jumping into the methodologies. So the reg in Program 3 language specifies 6 specific methodologies: the what-if checklist, hazard and operability study, or HAZOP, fault tree analysis, and failure modes and effects analysis. So, and just up here, I've split it up into the qualitative, or what are considered the qualitative assessments and the quantitative assessments. And really, we're just going to be focusing on the qualitative assessments, because that's what we normally see. And of these 4, really, we're looking at the bottom 2, the what-if checklist and the HAZOP. Those 2 assessments are really what we've seen in practice in Contra Costa County. I want to say there are no facilities that I can think of that use just the what-if or just the checklist specifically. Everyone has really moved to using the combined what-if checklist or to a full hazard and operability study. So starting with the what-if is really just that. It's taking a look at your process and asking a bunch of questions saying, what if this happens? And yeah, it sounds like a really simple approach, but with regards to how you can run a what-if analysis, it really depends on how much experience you have with your process, how much knowledge you have with regards to what can go wrong. So with regards to the equipment, how the equipment runs in certain in certain conditions, and really the main focus for a lot of these assessments is really going to be around how good is your team? How good are they at identifying hazards and properly assessing them? So this is just a simple what-if table that I took up from the CCPS Guidelines for Hazard Evaluation Procedures book. But typically you'll see a question posed, the hazard that's related to that question, the consequence, what potential safeguards are there, and any recommendations if needed to either beef up your safeguards or find a way to improve your process. So some of the pros and cons, again, the what if is relatively simple and it is quite flexible. Because it's more of a brainstorming methodology, you can apply it to any process and really come up with some good questions and have a good analysis. But again, it is really heavily dependent on your team composition and your team experience. And another note there, it's not an inherently structured technique because you're really developing a bunch of questions, initially at least, for your initial PHA or hazard review. You're just coming up with those questions. Later on, you can build off of previous what-if analyses and really build upon previous experience. Second one is a checklist, and again, another relatively straightforward approach to analyzing hazards. You're just going down a list, and really it tends to be more of a compliance-focused approach in terms of hazard analysis. So you have a pre-developed list of potential concerns. Maybe certain industries have developed checklists. I know the EPA has developed a couple checklists alongside the AWWA for like water treatment plants or wastewater treatment plants. There are a couple checklists developed by trade associations like IIAR for ammonia refrigeration, but those I believe tend to be more focused on mechanical integrity more so than hazard assessment. So just be aware of that. And typically with these checklists, again, the onus is more on you have a checklist to use, but you still need to supplement it with process-specific information. So again, that's where the team element comes in and the team experience really shines in determining whether or not you have a good checklist analysis or not. I don't really have too much to say about the what-if checklist approach. When you take into account the what-if, the brainstorming portion, as well as the checklist portion, you have a relatively structured approach to analyzing your hazards, but it also gives you that flexibility of saying, okay, what else can we think of and what can we put down? But again, it all really comes down to how good is your team when you're doing this assessment. So taking a look at HAZOP, this tends to be more of a beast than the other methodologies with regards to how it is or how it can be implemented. So just to cover the basics of HAZOP, the two main characteristics are one, you take your process and you divide it up into various nodes. So say, in this example, right, the node that they've identified is just an inlet line to the process. The second characteristic is taking a guide word parameter approach to identifying deviations in your process. So in this case, the guide word that they used is no. The parameter for the scenario is flow. So you're looking at a no-flow scenario and what could potentially cause that, right? In this scenario, you're looking at during an initial startup of a no-flow scenario due to a valve V1 failing closed mechanically. So going down that line, you've identified a deviation, you identified a potential cause, and now you're going through and identifying what are the potential consequences of that closed valve and what potential safeguards that you may have. So after identifying the safeguards, typically you'll either identify, okay, maybe there are some recommendations that need to be made, maybe there are some safeguards that we need to put in. But that really comes down to this middle section, this SLR, which is risk ranking. So taking a look at how severe is that consequence? What is the likelihood of that consequence? And from that, typically, when you're doing risk ranking, you'll have a matrix saying, okay, here are some outcomes that could potentially happen. We're going to rank these between 1, 5, A through E. These are the likelihoods every 10 years, every 100 years, every 1,000 years. And based off this matrix, you're going to say, okay, is this risk acceptable to us, right? So in this scenario, they ranked severity as a 3, they ranked likelihood as a 3, and they ranked the overall risk as a 7. If you don't have that matrix, those numbers mean nothing. So that is one thing that you want to watch out for when you're doing a PHA, when you're looking at a HAZOP or a what-if checklist. Regardless of the methodology that you use, risk ranking is going to be the key method of interpreting those results. So a couple pros and cons for the HAZOP. One, it's an inherently structured methodology. You have the division of your process into nodes. You have a breakdown of the potential consequences by using the guide word and parameter approach. And really, the number of guide words that you can use can differ based on the complexity of the process. So we've seen typically on average 7 guide words used. And the CCPS book that I mentioned earlier, the Guidelines for Hazard Evaluation Procedures, they outline quite a few guide words that could potentially be used for process analysis. One of the cons I could think of really was that it tends to be more time intensive than other methodologies, just because you're going through such a structured and methodological approach. Sorry. But yeah, and because of that, you tend to bring in more people into a HAZOP with more diverse backgrounds. So not only do you have process operations there, you'll typically have engineering, maintenance, potentially like materials experts to look at each of those scenarios and really flush it out. So with that being said, that covers the methodologies. And now I want to just dive a little bit into what kind of deficiencies that we've seen in Contra Costa County. Just a quick note on the data. I'm only taking it from active CalArts facilities, so if you really wanted to right now, you could fact check me on most of this stuff, if you really want to go through that. Time range for the data is going to be from between 2000 and 2018, and in those 18, 19 years, there have been a lot of name changes. We have quite a few large facilities within our county, and if you try to look up, some of our refineries, they've changed names 3, 4, 5 times within that time frame. So I wish you luck if you can find that data. And of course, with every data set, one could say that the data has been cherry-picked and numbers don't really matter. If none of you get that reference, it's from Whose Line Is It Anyway? For those of you avid watchers, I am sorry, but Drew Carey is by far the better host. Sorry, Aisha Taylor. So going into Program 2 requirements,
What was the M&A?
mergers and acquisitions.
Thank you.
Sorry. So right now, this graph doesn't really mean too much, and I want to explain a bit of how I digested the data. So Contra Costa County developed a bunch of checklists for each of the program or prevention program elements. And within each of those questionnaires, we really broke it up into, okay, we took the reg, we identified a requirement, and we developed a question out of it. And just along the bottom axis, those are just our questions. There's a legend in the back of the PowerPoint if you really want to get into, okay, what kind of questions are we asking and how does that tie up to the reg? But just for simplicity's sake, I've graphed it as such. I just really want to focus on these 3 peaks right here. So taking a look at those, the first one is with regards to resolving hazard review action items in a timely manner and documenting the results. So as with most processes, closing out can be quite difficult in some circumstances. And from what we've seen, the majority of our deficiencies, our facilities deficiencies, have come from not necessarily completing all the action items on time or failing to document the action items within the report and how they were completed. The second common issue was with regards to that in physical inspection of the equipment to ensure that it meets design codes and standards. And really, our process of evaluating that requirement is to see within the hazard review procedure, are they including a walk down of their process? If so, was there anything of note that was documented there? If they don't have anything like that, then you could potentially interview the facility personnel to see, okay, what was actually done in the last hazard review? What was your process? But if it wasn't written into the procedure, that would be something to bring up and question. And the last one is with regards to external events, taking a look at those requirements with regards to the PHA. And really, it comes down to conducting a separate seismic assessment. Has the facility conducted that separate seismic assessment? Have they followed up on any potential recommendations that came out of that assessment? And do they follow the same approach with regards to resolving those recommendations? Does it follow the same approach as the rest of the hazard review or PHA? So those are the most common issues. Looking at program 3, again, this graph doesn't mean too much unless you look at the legend in the back, but I wanted to highlight those 4. And the first one is really similar to program 2. Again, it's a seismic assessment and making sure that they meet those requirements, especially with regards to documentation. The last 3 really are with regards to the program 3 specific requirements of facility siting, human factors, and the last one is with regards to communication of PHA recommendations to affected personnel. With regards to the facility siting and human factors deficiencies, so Contra Costa has developed a couple checklists for both facility siting and human factors, and we do encourage our facilities to use those checklists just as part of their PHA, whether they're doing a what-if checklist or a HAZOP, to include those checklists in there if they're missing, if they don't already have a method of evaluating those requirements. And the last one is with regards to communication of PHA recommendations. This can be a little hard to really nail down during an inspection or audit, mainly because the PHA is renewed on a 5-year cycle. You first want to check to see, okay, does the facility have a process or a procedure in place to communicate those results of the PHA and those recommendations? If that's the case, if they do have a process in place, then you do want to follow it up with employee interviews. But that being said, something that happens 5 years ago, if you can remember it exactly, I would be surprised. But it is a requirement, and you want to make sure that at least the process is in place for that communication to take place. That being said, I just wanted to wrap up with, this graph is just taking the number of deficiencies that we've identified for PHAs and hazard reviews and taking a look at it chronologically. So over time, how have our facilities fared? Are they doing better? Are they doing worse? And overall, it looks like, at least within Contra Costa, our facilities are doing better on the overall. There is a little blip at 2015 due to the change or the update in regulations. And yeah, some of our facilities kind of dropped the ball in remembering to update their policies and procedures with regards to the documentation, the new documentation requirements, as well as the new timelines for not just PHAs, but also incident investigations and compliance audits. But overall, I'd like to say that Contra Costa is doing okay. With that being said, I think I can turn it over to Nicole to talk more in detail about our auditing process.
Thank you, Kevin. Can everyone hear me okay? It's good to see a lot of familiar faces here from the CUPAs and also from industry. I'm going to be focusing on what I like to call horizontal auditing with PHAs. Kevin went over a lot of the regulatory requirements and a lot of the detail of what goes into a PHA, how PHAs are done. I'm going to focus more on what you can do once you're actually in the facility with the audit. And I'm not going to give away all of our tips and tricks, but for those from industry who are in Contra Costa County, you'll get a little bit more insight into why we do what we do. So if anyone's ever looked at a PHA binder, and I had some with me, but unfortunately they got left in my car, you know that a lot of the PHA binders usually are pretty thick. They're about this big, maybe stacks of 5 binders. Maybe for a Program 2 facility, it might just be one smaller binder, but they are very detailed studies. And for my talk, I will be focusing mostly on the HAZOP methodology, but when you think about it, performing your hazard review or PHA, what it really comes down to is evaluating risk, what the consequences of that can be, and what you need to do to help mitigate that risk. So everything that I'm saying for a HAZOP can easily be applied to any other PHA hazard review methodology that you might see when you're performing an audit. So due to the size of the PHAs, I sometimes say it can feel like you're searching for a needle in a haystack, right? Where would you even start? How can a PHA even help me look at other prevention program elements? So the PHA can have impacts on many other topics. First and foremost, when the team is starting to do their PHA, mechanical integrity comes into play. Are they adequately maintaining equipment that they will identify as safeguards? And we'll get into what a safeguard means later on in this presentation. For revalidations, managements of change, and pre-startup safety reviews, are these changes recorded in the PHAs? And I know everyone's thinking, Program 2 doesn't have to do a management of change, but if they've made very significant changes to their facility, they should have a process in order to make sure that that change was done properly. And I have seen a lot of facilities in our county elect to use the management of change process. So it can come into play for a Program 2 facility. And for incident investigations, again, are all relevant incidents considered in this PHA? Do they talk about incidents that have happened not only at their site, but also in industry that can help them identify scenarios within this review? And yes, there's still more to PHAs. So Contra Costa County has also used PHAs to identify auditing focal points. We'll look for operating procedures, relief and other safety devices, and MOCs to help us do other things in the PHA. So for example, an operating procedure we could use as a reference for performing what we call a procedure walkdown. This is a technique that we developed a couple of years ago that helps us get into the field and walk around with an experienced operator to check for procedures being current and accurate, and also to make sure that conditions in the field are good. We also will look at relief and safety devices to help us evaluate safety or process safety information in our maintenance and mechanical integrity program. And we'll also look for sections of the HAZOP with multiple MOCs as potential for piping and instrumentation diagram walkdowns, which is another technique we've developed very similar to the operating procedure walkdown, where we will take a PNID and go evaluate it in the field to make sure that that PNID is also current and accurate. So when you're looking at a HAZOP or a PHA or any other methodology, what do we want to review? And I want to take a minute to comment on all of the examples Kevin and I are using. If anyone has ever tried to Google HAZOP examples, there's not a lot out there. And we cannot use things that we have been seeing in our exact facilities, obviously. So I'll give credit to everyone who has put out free training resources for us to use, but I want to say that a lot of these examples are not typically what we're seeing. What we'll see might be a little bit more detailed. People have improved the way they've done HAZOPs over time, and I'm just working with the most relevant information I can find out there. So let's go first on what you would review. So in this example, I have a page from a HAZOP. When we're at an audit, can you guys see that? No. All right, well, when we're at an audit, we focus mainly in two of the columns, the safeguard column and the recommendation column. As you can see here, this safeguard calls out a specific operating procedure, SOP 99005. So first and foremost, one of the things we would do is we would request that procedure from the facility. One, to make sure it exists. You won't believe how many times we've actually asked for a procedure just to find that they have gotten rid of the procedure or combined it with another procedure. And then second, we will review that procedure to make sure it's current and accurate. We'll also look into the recommendation columns. In this example, you can see that they've also called out a maintenance procedure to be updated. If the PHA we're reviewing is not too new, again, we will check to make sure that that recommendation has been incorporated into it. If we go to our next example, I'm sorry that my laser pointer doesn't, here we go. So we talked a little bit about being able to identify things for the mechanical integrity program. Here, one of the safeguards is a relief valve PSV 102, which is size for glass blow-by. So what we can do from here is we can select this specific PSV and check one, that it was designed correctly for the process, which helps with the process safety information portion of the audit. And then secondly, we can take a look at the mechanical integrity records and make sure that the pop tests were done correctly on time, that those records were maintained for the history of the piece of equipment. And I think you guys kind of get the idea. You know, these, again, as I was saying, these are very specific examples, and what we see out in our auditing experience looks a lot different, but I think it helps you see how when you're looking at a PHA, you can easily identify different equipment, different operating procedures, and use that for your auditing process. When looking at PHA revalidations, again, we talked about good revalidations should have a listing of the MOCs that they looked at, so you can be able to identify any PHA nodes that have multiple MOCs. This means a lot of changes have occurred to that part of the process, and it's a good candidate for a walk down. And when you're looking at the PHAs, they should also have a listing of their incidents that they reviewed. And there's potential incidents for you to follow up on for your incident investigation program. Again, this is all PHA age dependent. And one of the reasons that we like to use the PHA to help us focus on this is when going to a facility, you can be handed a list of operating procedures, MOCs, and incidents, and it can be quite extensive. If you go into the PHA and see the operating procedures that they've called out, the incidents that have affected their process, it gives you a better idea of maybe some of those things are contributing more to the safety of the overall risk of the process, because that's what the PHA is doing, right? It's evaluating the risk of your process. So if something was important enough to be called out as a safeguard in the PHA, that means it's pretty important to the facility, and so it's pretty important that they have that current and accurate and correct. So we did an evaluation at the beginning of the class, wanting to know how many people wanted us to dive into Program 4 stuff, and there was just a couple of people that this is relevant to, so I will go through this a little bit. I know if you attended Michael and I's Program 4 training, you've already seen this, but I did want to mention that in addition to everything else I've talked about, for a Program 4 facility, the PHAs can also help you identify potential safeguard protection analysis candidates through the risk rank scenarios. So just to briefly go into that, when we talk about safeguard protection analysis or LOPAs or anything related to that, there's a lot of terms that we commonly see. Initiating cause, safety instrumented systems, safeguard, independent protection layers. I'm really going to focus on just safeguards and independent protection layers. And for those with a Program 2 or a Program 3 facility, I think this is also relevant because when we get into what is the difference between a safeguard versus an IPL, as we call the independent protection layers, it's relevant to all facilities. We actually will see a lot of facilities identifying their IPLs, and we like to see IPLs listed as safeguards and PHAs. So what is the main difference between these two things? All IPLs are safeguards, but not all safeguards are IPLs. And the really big difference is the independence. An IPL is really focusing on stopping the scenario right when it starts, whereas safeguards can focus on stopping that scenario, but also they can be for mitigating just how bad the scenario's consequences can be. And when we talk about LOPA or safeguard protection analysis, it deals with IPLs and not safeguards. So if we take a look at, again, a very simplistic list I have here of safeguards versus IPL, some things that we might see in PHAs as common safeguards, which we might not feel are very strong safeguards, is having an emergency response program. Again, that's something that'll help mitigate the scenario, but it will not prevent the scenario's consequences from happening. Training and procedures, operator intervention, again, are all things that can help make the scenario, help mitigate the risk of the scenario, but not stop the scenario completely from getting to the consequence. And non-independent safety devices. Independence is very key for IPLs. It cannot rely on anything else to work. Things that we look at that are IPLs, are independent safety devices, safety instrumented systems, interlocks, things that'll automatically shut down the process. And, not to be confusing, but operator intervention could be seen as an independent protection layer, assuming that it is completely independent from how the scenario starts. So quickly, really, the three enoughs for IPLs we're looking at is if it's big enough, fast enough, or strong enough. So I wanted to go next kind of into a group activity because I know that I'm throwing a lot of words out there and quickly going over some examples and really focus on the word safeguard. So I thought we could kind of go step by step really into looking at some PHA safeguards and discussing if these safeguards are something that would be useful to us during an audit, and talk a little bit about the difference between safeguards and IPLs. So don't worry, I know it's really early in the morning. I'm not going to ask for a lot of participation. We'll just step through it together, and we'll just do show of hands instead of asking people directly. So going back to the first example that Kevin had brought up of a HAZOP, if we look in the safeguard column here, at the very first deviation of no flow, we'll see that their safeguards listed is a PM program for valves, a fire suppression system, and operators are wearing fire retardant clothing. Anyone think any of this can help us with horizontal PHA auditing? Not really. They're not giving us much to go on. There's no discussion of exact equipment. We know pretty much that operators are almost always wearing no-mix if they're in, refineries or chemical facilities, so that's not really helping. And fire suppression system, again, that's something that will help after the fact, but it's not going to help stop the scenario. So not really much we can do with this, and I'll say that if you are auditing and you see safeguards like this in the PHA, I'd really start asking some questions about who did the PHA, why were there no other safeguards considered, just kind of, dig a little bit deeper. This next example here, we have a failure of a flow control so that the valve goes closed, and we have some safeguards, operator intervention based on some high temperature alarms, operator intervention based on a low flow alarm, and SIS stands for safety instrumented system. And we have some safety instrumented system, which is going to stop the flow once it detects high temperature. So who thinks we can do something with this during an audit? Yeah, I would agree. This has given us a lot of information. We have different alarms and instrumented systems to check on the mechanical integrity for. One of the things that we would also ask is, well, how do the operators know what sort of intervention they need to do? Is there an operating procedure associated with this task? And we could look for that procedure and ask for it and review it for content and accuracy. This next example, we have, as a safeguard, a very specific procedure call-up, procedure SOP 37. Step 4.3 states to verify that the valve is open. So what do we think about this in terms of auditing? Again, I think everyone would agree with me, this would be something that would lead to a lot of different activities for us, especially calling out specifically this step 4.3. We would want to make sure that that step exists in the procedure, talk to the operators and see if that is the right step, make sure that that procedure is current and accurate. In this next example, for low level, it talks about operator rounds include monitoring of the tank level once per shift. And so this one, how many think that you can maybe do something in an audit with it? I've got 1 vote, 2 votes. I got a lot of people looking at me like, well, maybe, I'm not sure. So this is interesting. Operator rounds is something that during our audits, gives us an opportunity to go ask more questions of the operators. We will go and have interviews with them and find out what these rounds look like. Sometimes it can be a checklist for them to fill out. We've seen some facilities that have handheld electronic devices that they're supposed to take out. And so for this one, it can give you a lot of information during the audit in terms of procedures and how things are done if they are actually recording it. If they're not recording it, again, then I would kind of question the safeguard. How do they know that the operators are actually doing the rounds and that in this case, monitoring of the tank level is actually occurring? It gives you different things to think about in terms of evaluating the PHA and how good of a job they did at the PHA, as well as looking at other prevention program elements. And this one, I don't know if anyone can read this actually on the screen, but the safeguards all in here are really all talking about safety instrumented functions, safety SIS functions, and this was really for, if we were going to get deep into the program 4, it was going to help us talk a little bit more about safeguard protection analysis. But I would say the gist here is when you're seeing a lot of different equipment and safety instrumented systems listed, again, they have very specific requirements on how they're to be maintained. So that gives you an opportunity to look deeper into the mechanical integrity program and ensure that they are doing the correct things to maintain these important devices. So the next part that I want to go into is being invited to a PHA. In Contra Costa County, we have made a concerted effort to reach out to our facilities and have them inform us when their PHA revalidations will be starting so that we can observe for a day or two the process. Are there any other CUPAs that have done that for their facilities here? Great. You know, we feel it's a really good practice to do. One, it kind of keeps us in touch with the facilities a little bit more often than just going once every 3 years for the audits. And we get to see firsthand how they're performing their PHAs or hazard reviews. And for those who haven't been into a PHA, I'm going to go into a little bit of what we look for there, what are some of the red flags during a PHA. So you've been invited to a PHA. For all my Hamilton fans here, you're finally in the room where it happens. What do you do from there? First and foremost, PHAs can have impacts on employee participation for Program 3 facilities, but for Program 2, I think this is also important as well. Take a look at the PHA team composition. Does it have the right people in there? Do they have an operator? Do they have people who are familiar with the process, not just people who know how to perform a PHA? As Kevin said, due to the complexity of the process, you might need engineering there or other specialties. And also, it helps you identify some key personnel. So when you go back for the audit, you know who sat in there, and you might want to interview them during the audit to get their perspective on the rest of the PHA or other prevention program elements. And once the PHA starts, the way that we look at it, our role there really is to be an observer. No one's going to expect you to know the ins and outs of the process or to contribute to what some of the consequences will be. You're there to observe the PHA, and really, it doesn't mean that you can't speak up ever, though. If you see something from a regulatory perspective that doesn't seem right, I would encourage each and every one of you to speak up and, kind of help redirect the PHA. But we also want to make sure, that we don't take over, and start interjecting throughout the entire PHA. So it's a very delicate balance. But as I said, I'm going to give a few examples for those of you who have never done this before as to when you might want to speak up. So, the first one, who remembers the Micro Machine guy? He talks about all the different cars they have. They have the red, blue, and orange 2 wheels and 4 wheels and 5-wheel drive, and the people are talking so fast and no one understands what he's saying. If anyone can actually follow what I'm saying, raise your hands right now so I know you're still with me. I have actually many times seen facilitators who go so fast in the hazard review or PHA that you literally cannot keep up. For example, I was sitting in a PHA and the facilitator said, okay, we're going to look at no flow for this tank, and I don't think there's any other consequences going on. And all of us looked at each other like, where was the discussion going on here? The operator looked like he wanted to say something but didn't want to speak up as they went on for 3 other deviations. And finally, we had to say, you know what? We think we need to maybe slow this down a little bit and really evaluate the process. So if you're in a PHA and it is going very fast, the facilitator's whipping through it, maybe he's got to catch his flight home, definitely speak up and ask them to slow it down so that people can put in the input that they need to. Another important thing that Kevin talked about was performing walkdowns as part of the PHA process. So if the PHA team forgets to go out and perform the walkdown, that is something else you would want to speak up about, especially if you're there the first day of the PHA. From our perspective, these walks should be one of the first things that you do. It'll help you identify any changes that you might have missed on the P&IDs out in the field. You'll have your human factors and facility siting checklist completed, so you'll know if there's any problems identified out in the field. And it gives the PHA team the best information possible to work with when evaluating all of the scenarios. And as Kevin also said, one of the big things that we see is people actually forget to do these checklists. So if you don't see that on the agenda, I would also speak up and just kind of remind them, hey, you have an obligation to do a facility siting checklist or the human factors checklist or evaluate your external events. And I've put up here an example of the Contra Costa County facility siting checklist. And we also have a link to our website where if anyone needed a copy, we have a siting checklist and a human factors checklist. And last but not least, but I think the most important, risk ranking. Kevin talked a little bit about what risk ranking looked like and why it's important to the PHA. So if you're sitting in a PHA and you do not see some sort of colored matrix that looks like this, or there's no talk about risk ranking a scenario at all, I would definitely speak up and really question the adequacy of the PHA that is being performed at that facility. Again, this is another example of what risk ranking can look like. I wanted to just reiterate here, we're looking for some sort of columns with numbers or a combination of numbers and letters. Every facility does it differently, but just something that shows that they're evaluating the likelihood and the consequences and how severe that is combined together. So with that, I want to open it up to any questions or any discussions that people would like to have further into what Kevin and I have presented. I really want to thank all of you for being here with us at 8 a.m. today on the first day of the conference. And again, if anyone has questions, because this is being recorded, we ask that you come up to the microphone in the center and Kevin and I will answer for you. Thank you.
Hi there. Wonder if you could just tell us what are some of the other guide words that you use in HAZOP. Flow was the first one discussed.
Oh, yes, that's a very good question. So if we go back to guide words, there's actually a long list, and we can provide some more examples. But usually we're looking at things like no flow, low flow, high temperature, low temperature, kind of going through just the list of different parameters, high pressure, low pressure. And getting deeper into how a HAZOP is done, we also have a selected list of guide words that we think are useful for checking on all modes of operation. So things like startup, shutdown, looking at what happens for corrosion. Kevin, maybe you can think of some others that I haven't mentioned.
The other ones are like more, less.
Oh, more, less.
What he brings up parameters, differentiating.
Yeah, so we want to make sure too that we differentiate between the guide words and the parameters. So the guide words are the no, more, less, misdirected, and then the parameters will be for flow, temperature, pressure. It could even be for pH, depending on your process. I know we said that there could be up to 20, but I don't think I could say 20 off the top of my head. I don't know if anyone, Mike, Robert, Habib, have any others for us? Other than is a good one too. I'm sorry? Oh, as well as? Yeah, I think the best listing will be in the CCPS book that we had mentioned, but hopefully that helps go a little bit more than just the no that we focused on.
Good morning. We'll try to stand up straight here and not knock the microphone over. On your walkthroughs, how thorough do you do on the walkthrough for a PHA or for an inspection? Are you climbing towers, just in terms of the type of facilities that you go to? I know you have some large chemical manufacturing and maybe refinery facilities in your jurisdiction. If you could just comment on how extensive your walkthrough is. Thank you.
Sure. So whenever we go to a facility, we really try and minimize any walk down that we do to about an hour, hour and a half worth of time. We understand that, we're taking away from the facility's work time, so we try not to make it too extensive. But that hour and a half time will involve going out into the field. If needed, yes, we will climb tanks. We'll walk down certain sections of the process for either the procedure or the piping and instrumentation diagram. So we usually try and not do too much. We won't just go look at one tank, but we won't do an entire P&ID either. Or for an operating procedure, we will select steps from the procedure versus doing the entire procedure itself. And what we're really looking for there is either in the P&ID or in the procedure is something where there could be errors, right? So we're looking for a specific equipment called out, a lot of opening or turning of valves or other equipment. In operating procedures, we sometimes look also too for steps that have interaction between the field operator and the board operator. Now again, depending on the complexity of the process, that might not exist, right? So if we were at an ammonia refrigeration facility, for example, there's not really a lot of that going on, and of a field and inside operator, usually it's just, one person who will be performing all of the steps. So then we will just walk down the procedure with them as best we can and perform an interview afterwards. Same thing for the process and instrumentation diagram. If there is a one process facility, sometimes we can look at the entire process. A good example of that would be ammonia used for SCR. You know, we can go look at the tank and the associated piping and probably get all of that done within the hour. So it's kind of we have to balance it, you know, depending on the facility. Do you have a question, Dan?
In your discussion about safeguards,
Yes.
one of the things that I've come across a lot of times is you'll see that they say they have safeguards and then they relate them to their risk ranking, but they're really not related to their risk ranking at all. And they use safeguards that aren't really safeguards. Could you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, so that's kind of the point that I was trying to make in showing all of these different examples is, you know, when someone just says that they have training, you can't really risk rank and say that your risk is mitigated just because you have training, right? So there is a hierarchy, maybe I want to say, and, you know, what would really be a good safeguard. When people just say that, oh, I have a mechanical integrity program, we have operating procedures, typically, from our perspective, we don't really see those as safeguards. We want to see, okay, we have this specific procedure that'll do this, or we have this interlock that can help prevent the scenario. So when a facility does that, then I will question their PHA and ask them, how did you arrive to this risk ranking then? And usually what I find is that even though they might have a list of 10 different things that they've identified as safeguards, they're really focusing their risk ranking on, you know, 2 of the bigger things, and that usually has to do with some sort of interlock or some sort of safety device or relief device that's helping them figure out what the risk actually is, and the rest they're putting in there to kind of just, you know, give them credit for all of the good and hard work that they're doing. Are there any other questions? Oh, Fariba?
Good morning. How do you do your RMP formal evaluation? Do you combine it with your inspection or do you do it separately? I just want to know what your process is.
A little of both. How is that for an answer? No. We typically, when an RMP is submitted to our office, we will do that review independently from the audit, and we go and audit our facilities once every 3 years about. And when we are at the audit, we actually do have a question at the end of every single one of our questionnaires that says, does the RMP accurately describe the program here on site? So even though we've reviewed the entire RMP in our office, when we're on site, we're making sure that the way they describe the program, how the program is actually ran, is how we found it to be during the audit. And I know that we're, you know, very unique and fortunate that we have a team of 7 people and we get to be at a facility for multiple days to look at all of this information, so we're able to handle it in that way, and I know not everyone will be able to do it the same way that we do. Hi, Randy.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you doing?
Great, it's good to see you again. I noticed that you said that you'd like to be invited to some PHAs.
Yes.
Would it be beneficial to invite CUPAs to mechanical integrity inspections? We have those periodically. Maybe that would give you a broader spectrum and understanding of what we actually do during our mechanical integrity inspections.
From my perspective, I will try and attend anything that any of my facilities invite me to. I think that the more often we get to be there and see how your processes work and how the reviews are done in person is always beneficial. Now, we might not always have time to, but if you wanted to send that over to our office, I think that would be great. And I would encourage other facilities to develop this sort of, you know, open working relationship with their CUPAs. I think it really helps in terms of, you know, ensuring that you guys are in compliance and making sure that if you have any questions, we address those ahead of time versus at the actual audit.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. It's good to see you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Little Tom. I have a 2-part question. If there's a safeguard called out, do you always look out for a PM for that safeguard? And is there any reason why there wouldn't be a PM for a safeguard?
So I'll address the first portion. When we're looking at PHAs, as I stated, they're usually pretty big documents, so we can't look at everything. And so usually what we'll try and do is, tab a couple of different pieces of equipment from different nodes so that we can get a good cross-section of the process. So we don't look at a PM for every single one. But if there is a piece of equipment called out as a safeguard, I would say there should be a PM that exists for it. If there's not, then that's going to give whoever's evaluating the maintenance or mechanical integrity program something else to follow up on, because relief devices should have some sort of PM. Anything you're using to protect your process really needs to be maintained, because you want to make sure that it's going to be there and it's going to work when you need it. I'm sorry? I don't think there's anything I would not expect to find a PM for, and so like I was saying, if you found that there wasn't one, I would just start asking a lot more questions as to why.
Hi, could you talk a little bit about procedural PHAs, or the concept of looking at a procedure a little bit through a PHA lens?
Sure, and if I forget anything, I'm sure you can help me, Michael, but so our county has an industrial safety ordinance, and part of that we ask facilities to perform procedural PHAs. But again, these techniques are things that can be used regardless of your facility program level determination. And so what a procedural PHA is it's really doing the same thing that a PHA does. It uses a set of guide words to evaluate the procedure, to identify, one, if there needs to be any procedural changes, and the accuracy of the procedure. So a procedural PHA, instead of looking at something such as no flow or high temperature, we'll look at things as missing step, or you performed the step wrong. And so it's a very good way to evaluate human errors that can occur. So I did a lot of discussion about looking at that safeguard column and how a lot of our facilities will identify procedures. And I made the point that if the procedure was critical enough to be identified as a safeguard, meaning it's protecting your process in some way, it better be right. It would be a best practice for a facility to perform a procedural PHA on it to make sure that they identify any human factors issues and correct them, make sure that the steps are in the correct order. Anything else, Kevin? You feel like I'm forgetting something with procedural PHAs? But really just to make sure that the procedure is as accurate as it can be. It's usable for the operators. I don't know if there's anything else. Are there any other questions for Kevin and I? No? All right, well then I guess we'll end a little bit early. If you, take some time to think about what we've presented and something seems unclear, or if you have questions about any other of the techniques that we identified during the presentation, we are here all week, so, you can come find Kevin and I, and we are happy to discuss any of this with you. We've also put our emails up here and our website, so you can always feel free to shoot us an email or take a look at our website for more resources. Thank you very much.